How's it going, everybody? And welcome back to another episode of the Armed Scholar Podcast. This is podcast number 17. And this is actually going to be a very interesting one because in this podcast, we're going to go through President Biden's response to the recent incident that occurred in Nashville, some of the talking points that he has been pushing since that incident, and some of the arguments and rationale that they're trying to use to push for a national ban on so-called assault weapons and a ban on so-called large capacity magazines. I did a shorter video over on the main channel, but on this podcast, I wanted to get a little bit more in depth, kind of give you some of my feelings and thoughts on the speech that he gave and just trying to dismantle some of the common anti-gun talking points that we see pop up after incidents like this. Now, I also want to mention that before we jump into this podcast, this is going to be the first podcast that is available audio form with our new partner over at Gas Digital Network. So if you're listening to this, you can potentially listen to this earlier. You can listen to this every Friday, which will actually come out before the video form, which will go out on my YouTube channel. So the YouTube channel for the podcast will release the podcasts every Monday morning at 7 a.m. Whereas if you listen audio form only, Gas Digital is going to get that early, and they're going to distribute it early so you can listen as early as Friday if you want. So I'm really excited to partner with Gas Digital Network. It's going to be hopefully something that helps expand the podcast, get more people interested in the Second Amendment, and also hopefully collaborate with more people who are not necessarily in the Second Amendment realm, but maybe who are interested in this type of topic. So without further ado, what I'm going to first do is throw up the speech, which is President Biden talking about the Nashville incident and some of his responses to that. So first, you're going to hear President Biden give his speech, and then I'm going to go through and pretty much try to dismantle all of the main talking points that he's putting forward.
You know, we need to act. These are weapons of war. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I have 2 shotguns. My sons have shotguns. You know, but our states, you know, everybody thinks somehow the Second Amendment is absolute. You're not allowed to go out and own an automatic weapon. You're not allowed to own a machine gun. You're not allowed to own a flamethrower. You're not allowed to own so many other things. Why in God's name do we allow these weapons of war in our streets and at our schools? According to law enforcement, the shooter in this horror had 2 assault weapons and a pistol. And what in God's name are we doing? These guns are the number. This is hard to believe. I never thought when I started my public life that guns would be the #1 killer of children in America. Guns, #1. It's sick. And overwhelmingly, a majority of gun owners agree. We have to do something. Not just everybody, the gun owners agree. There's a moral price to pay for inaction. Last year, we came together to pass the most significant gun safety legislation in 30 years. It was bipartisan. We got it done. And don't tell me we can't do more together. So I again call on Congress to pass the assault weapons ban. Pass it. It should not be a partisan issue. It's a common sense issue. They have to act now. People say, why do I keep saying this if they're not happening? Because I want you to know who isn't doing it, who isn't helping, to put pressure on them. You know, I know you see on television, it's not just merely the weapon in terms of that it's semi-automatic in effect, but the velocity with which it comes out of that muzzle, what it does when it hits the body. Most bullets would go just straight through and out, but it blows up once it's inside your body. What in God's name does anyone need that for in America?
So that's the speech that we're going to be talking about here in this podcast. You heard President Biden talk about a ton of different things in there. And so I just want to try to address as many of those as possible, give you my opinion from the Second Amendment side, from the Second Amendment attorney side, from the litigation side, and just hopefully round out this conversation because a lot of times what we hear is just the anti-gun talking points. Now, one of the first things that I want to address with all of this is first you hear him start off talking about these are weapons of war. Now, I know there's a ton of things to cover, and hopefully I can try to keep this as concise as possible. But first off, the firearms that were used during this incident was a Kel-Tec Sub 2000, which is a pistol caliber carbine. I don't know if this one was 9mm or 40. Haven't dug that deep, but essentially it's a pistol caliber carbine. If you want to know more about what a Kel-Tec Sub 2000 is, go watch Brandon Herrera's recent video. He's another YouTuber. If you don't know who he is, you should know who he is. But he did a review of some sorts, breaking down what a Kel-Tec Sub 2000 is. But it's a pistol caliber carbine. The other thing that the individual brought to this incident, I don't want to mention the person's name because they don't deserve to be named. They need to burn in hell, in my opinion. But the other firearm that the person brought to the school was a was a shield, and then which was just a handgun, and then they also brought an AR pistol, I believe, with a brace on it now, which that's probably going to cause a ton of issues within itself. So the whole use of the claim that this is a so-called like weapon of war just isn't simply true. Now, almost any firearm could be used for war purposes, really, if the military wanted. But the military is not using a Kel-Tec Sub 2000. I don't know of any military unit that's using shields. I just don't know. I mean, some of them may use some form of like an AR pistol, but most often they're just using SBRs, which is an AR platform in a certain configuration that normal civilians like us, we would have to go through the NFA and the ATF to have lawfully, which they're also trying to do with AR pistols of this style. So this whole idea that this is a weapon of war just isn't true. These types of firearms, no one would say that these civilian types of firearms are equivalent to military style weapons, like a fully automatic M16. So no one would say that. The civilian AR-15, although it could potentially be useful in military service, it's just not the same type of firearm. Now, even saying that, even starting with that, I want to say it doesn't matter. Even if these were so-called weapons of war, military style firearms, civilians under the Second Amendment have a fundamental right to possess, acquire, and use those types of firearms. Because if you look at the founding and if you look at the ratification of the Second Amendment, 1791, the type of firearms that civilians had at that time were the firearms that they possessed on their own and then brought for use in military service, in the militia or whatever. So to say that civilians cannot have military equivalent firearms is just not staying true to what our history and tradition teaches us, which is one of the main analysis now, especially when you look at what the Supreme Court recently said in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. The Supreme Court in Bruin said you have to analyze government restrictions looking at the text as informed by relevant history. That relevant history is looking at 1791, what laws, regulations, or whatever existed at that time. And then if the government wants to put forward a restriction, a modern restriction, they have to draw a equivalent to either a law that existed at that time or some sort of analog. So this whole theory that you can't have military style weapons, a civilian has no business having a military style weapon, is just not true. Because if you look at our history and tradition, civilians, those individuals that served in the militia, had firearms in their personal use that they used in their day-to-day lives, and then they would take that into service in the military, essentially. There was no great distinction between military weapons and civilian weapons. Even more so, you hear Biden, he didn't say it in this speech, which I was surprised by, but you hear him say quite often, like, well, back then you couldn't own a cannon. No one could own a cannon back then. And even people on the anti-gun side hate when he says that, because that's just not true historically. Historically, civilians could own, possess, and use cannons. Many did. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, there were private ships which had cannons, like entire like warships that had cannons, and then were essentially contracted by the government during the Revolutionary War to help fight against Britain. So there were private individuals in possession of ships and cannons. And even to this day, you can own, possess, and use a cannon. That is still lawful. So for Biden to say that you can't own a cannon or you can't own certain types of firearms and you never could, it's just simply not true. There is no there was historically never any true great distinction between military weapons and civilian weapons. The next thing that you heard him say in that speech is he talks about, well, he's a Second Amendment guy. He's a gun owner. He owns shotguns, and his sons own shotguns, which is interesting because I believe one of his sons is dead, and then his other son is a prohibited person, is a felon. Shouldn't be in possession of shotguns at all. So that's interesting, almost admitting of criminal conduct there. But this is, again, another interesting talking point that you see pop up quite a bit, especially on the anti-gun side. They like to first try to position themselves as like, I'm a gun owner. I'm one of you, which really they're not. And I think this is also important for the 2A side just in general. Just because someone is a gun owner or someone owns firearms or shoots firearms does not necessarily mean they are pro Second Amendment. There are a ton of groups right now that own firearms but would love to strip you of your right to keep and bear arms. And President Biden and his administration is no different. So you hear this said all the time that, I own shotguns, I own firearms, I'm a gun owner, I'm a 2A advocate, but you shouldn't. So anytime you hear that but, it just essentially means that everything they said before is just irrelevant. It's not true. But they love to put this forward. Now, this whole discussion of, well, I own shotguns. What they try to do, and what the anti-gun and the left has tried to do for a very long time, they try to do this in a ton of cases. And they've lost in lawsuits left and right on this type of argument. But what they try to do is they try to frame and cabin the right to keep and bear arms as only a right to own, possess, and use firearms that are useful only for hunting. They like to try to cabin your right to only hunting, which we all know is not true. The right to keep and bear arms is your right to self-preservation, your right to defend yourself, and to defend others' lives, and then also to defend yourself against a tyrannical government, both foreign and domestic, which is, again, it's kind of a twofold right, in my opinion. There are other things that come along with it, but, protecting your life is one of those core concepts which the Supreme Court has recognized. And then the other core aspect of the Second Amendment is defending yourself from a tyrannical government, but either your government or a foreign government. And you hear all the time, like during World War II, there was claimed statements from some Japanese generals that said, like, you couldn't invade the U.S. because there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. Now, whether or not that was actually said or not, there's some debate, but it's just very true. And that is one of the core concepts and one of the core basis of the Second Amendment is an armed populace prevents a tyrannical government, either your government from becoming tyrannical or from a foreign government from coming in and trying to be tyrannical. Now, that is important because nowhere in the Second Amendment does it cabin it only to hunting, but that's what the anti-gun side likes to do. Now, they still try to put forward those arguments all the time, even though the Supreme Court and even left-leaning courts have completely just got rid of that type of argument. It's just not even valid anymore in the legal realm. So that's an important distinction. And whenever you hear them say that, that's what they're still trying to do. They're trying to limit your right to arms to a specific subset of arms and trying to limit your right by saying you should only have hunting rifles and shotguns. So again, that's really important in regards to what they're saying. Now, another interesting thing they try to do all the time as well, which just has no more legitimate legal basis, is they try to say, well, what about a well-regulated militia? Your right to keep and bear arms is only tied to your service in the militia, is what they try to say, which isn't true and has absolutely no more legal authority. Was struck down by the Supreme Court in Heller. That legal argument has had no basis since 2008, but they still love to put it forward. Because in Heller, Justice Scalia, writing the opinion, stated the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It is not tied exclusively to service in the militia. I actually have a quote here that I want to say to you guys that's from Scalia in Heller, where he stated that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. So, as clearly stated by Scalia in Heller, you have an individual right to keep and bear arms, which is outside of your connection with being in the militia, which you love. I mean, the anti-gun side loves to still put forward that argument. Well, what about a well-regulated militia? And anytime I see that pop up on Twitter or speeches like this, or I see an anti-gun individual put forward that argument, well, you're forgetting a well-regulated militia. It just lets me know that they actually have done zero homework. Because if they wanted to put forward a valid argument or something that has some sort of weight currently, they wouldn't be putting forward that argument, because that argument has just had zero authority, has had zero weight for a very long time. So that's important. So anytime you are having a conversation with someone and they put forward that argument, just point them to Heller and be like, that's a lame argument. Essentially, that is a very lame argument. That argument has had zero basis for a long time, had zero basis even before Heller, because if you just looked at our history and tradition, which is what the Supreme Court did in Heller, they looked at, the prefatory clause and the operative clause of the Second Amendment, and how do these tie together? What does a well-regulated militia mean? Why did they put that in the text of the Second Amendment? And all that stuff. They did a historical analysis, and they came to the conclusion that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It is not exclusively tied to your service in a militia. So anytime you see that argument, just point them to Heller, and you can win that argument. That's I love when the anti-gun side puts forward that argument, because that's one of the easiest arguments to win, because it just has no basis. Now, you see a lot of kind of political individuals like Biden or David Hogg. Those individuals, I was going to say something bad. Those individuals, they put forward those arguments still, but you never see the government, the ATF, or the attorneys for those individuals put forward that argument anymore in the legal papers, because it just, again, has no weight. So that's another really important thing as far as what Biden is saying here. Another thing you hear Biden say in this quite a lot, and you hear him say in other speeches, is that the Second Amendment is not absolute. Now, this really is a talking point which comes from some unfortunate language, some dictum, which is essentially not binding authority within a opinion, but just simply a judge kind of going off on, I guess the best way to explain to you what dictum is, or dicta is in an opinion, is essentially when a judge is going off on some sort of tangent. It's not binding authority. They're just kind of going off on some thoughts. Now, in Heller, Justice Scalia did say that the Second Amendment is not unlimited like other rights. And then he talked about how there are some potentially presumptively lawful restrictions that the government could put forward. He talked about like prohibitions on felons or dangerous people. I believe background checks. I can't remember off the top of my head specifically what restrictions he said, but we saw that pop up again in Bruin, where they talked about maybe potentially presumptively lawful restrictions. Now, the Biden administration and the anti-gun side loves to latch onto that language in Heller and to say that the Second Amendment is not absolute, despite if you look at the actual text of the Second Amendment, which says shall not be infringed. That sounds fairly absolute to me. But they love to latch onto that language. Now, I think the answer to that really was flushed out by Justice Thomas in Bruin, when he talked about, yes, maybe there could be some presumptively lawful restrictions, or maybe some sort of government restrictions that could be put in place. But really, those restrictions are just simply those that existed at the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment in 1791. There were, and really that, they talk about the balancing of the public interest, and that analysis took place back in 1791. And that's really what you're supposed to look at. A lot of times you see the anti-gun side talk about public interest and public safety, and that's why we need XYZ restriction. But what Thomas said in Bruin is really that analysis took place way back then. If the anti-gun side doesn't like that now, that's unfortunate, but that's the price we pay for our fundamental rights, is that this weighting of the harm to the public safety and the right that is in question, that balance took place way back then. And that's why we look back to 1791. And since they did that weighted analysis, that balancing of interest, you might say, back then, that's why you look back to that time to determine what type of restrictions were weighted and were potentially acceptable at that time. So that's why there's that analysis that goes back to 1791. So when they say presumptively lawful, that doesn't mean that 100% an XYZ restriction, even Heller, because it's dictum. It doesn't necessarily hold any weight. They're just saying, potentially these restrictions could be lawful, but in Heller, they weren't doing that analysis. They weren't looking at whether prohibitions on felons in possession of fire and ammunition is lawful. They didn't do that analysis in Heller. They didn't do an analysis on possession of firearms by mentally compromised individuals. They didn't do an analysis on sensitive places in Heller. So that is something that would have to come in later cases. And that's also what Bruin stated. They said that if you can, of course, the government could try to put in place a restriction, but they are going to have to use the text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment to show that there is some basis for that restriction dating back to 1791. And to prove that it is a presumptively lawful restriction. So that is just kind of the weird twisting that is going on. And that's why Biden, and I don't know if he necessarily, I would say he doesn't actually know why he's saying that the Second Amendment is not absolute, that's where he's drawing that language from, is that Heller language. It's obviously just being fed to him and he keeps regurgitating it, but that is essentially where that's coming from. I know, in my opinion, the Heller decision written by Scalia, I love Scalia. I love the way he writes, but I think there were some very unfortunate things in the Heller opinion and some unfortunate language that's been latched on and causes a lot of issues and litigation down the road after Heller. And really, I just think that's a product of, at the time when Heller and that decision came out, there was not as favorable of justices on the Supreme Court. So there had to be some more give and take to get a positive pro 2A decision that Scalia wanted to write. So there was some give or take, and there was some compromises made on language. And I think that's why we got some unfortunate language. Now, even when you look at Bruin and the opinion of Bruin, even though it was a 6-3 opinion, you still had some individuals on the court writing concurrences. You had Alito, I believe. Then you had Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. I think one of the more unfortunate things that came out of Bruin was the concurrence by Justice Kavanaugh, because, again, Justice Kavanaugh almost reiterated that Heller dictum, saying, presumptively lawful restrictions, and we don't want to bring some of those things into question and things of that nature, which was unfortunate when I read the Bruin decision in the first place. I don't know if that was 100% necessary. And then you had Justice Amy Coney Barrett in her concurrence. She talked about, where do we actually do the historical analysis? She was questioning, maybe do you look at some later dates, maybe when you're dealing with a state-specific Second Amendment issue. And she was essentially opening the door for maybe that there needed to be discussion about that going down the road. And I think that's also just led to some of these after cases that are dealing with Second Amendment litigation. Now you're seeing the anti-gun side trying to still put forward later history, sometimes latching onto Amy Coney Barrett and her language about potentially using later history of the 1860s era, the Reconstruction era, things like that as a basis for federal restrictions. So, all of this is important as far as context. Why is Biden and his administration saying a certain thing? Why does the anti-gun side say a certain thing? Why are they using this specific language? Where is that coming from? And you as a 2A advocate, you as a gun owner, knowing more than them, essentially knowing why they are using that language, where that came from, and you being able to say, well, actually, the thing that you're saying is not entirely correct because its context matters. You're saying the Second Amendment is not absolute, but do you actually know why you're saying that? Now, I don't always necessarily advocate that, you go after, friends or family if you're talking about firearms, just because your, crazy aunt or uncle is at your Thanksgiving dinner and says something about the Second Amendment. You shouldn't blow up the entire night just arguing about the Second Amendment because they say something. But the whole goal with the channel and here with this podcast and this one specifically is just giving you some more tools in case you engage in those conversations, to be able to talk about it in a very educated way and a knowledgeable way, and give you some more essentially weapons to refute these really bad arguments and these just anti-gun talking points that they love to throw out all the time. Now, the next thing that you hear Biden talk about is, again, something that's just 100% false. He says that you can't own an automatic weapon in the US. You can't own a machine gun in the US. And you can't own a flamethrower in the US, which we all know is not true. Despite the NFA and the GCA, you can still be in lawful possession of automatic weapons, machine guns, and flamethrowers are not even federally regulated at all. So first, let's talk about flamethrowers. That's just 100% false. I think there's only one state, which is, I believe, Maryland, which has a state level restriction on the possession and use of flamethrowers. Really, I don't think there's a whole lot of other state restrictions. I think California has some restrictions, but there is definitely no federal restriction on the possession and use of flamethrowers. So again, just false, just some talking points that they love to throw out there to try to bolster their position when it's not even a valid talking point. At least if you're going to make an argument for something, actually make sure it's a logical and rational argument and has some sort of weight to it. But you will see a lot of times out of these speeches, it's a lot of more based on emotion than logic. So again, flamethrower issue, false. As far as automatic weapons and machine guns, again, false. It is harder, of course, to acquire, possess, own, and use automatic weapons and machine guns because they are restricted under the GCA and NFA. Suppressors are restricted under the NFA. So there are, of course, restrictions in place, federal restrictions, but that doesn't mean that you can't own and possess those items. There may be some state level restrictions that also prohibit you from being in possession of those items. But I know plenty of people who are in possession of automatic weapons. You've probably seen a ton of gun YouTubers who are in possession of machine guns and automatic weapons because they are not, illegal. As long as you go through the federal paperwork, which is unconstitutional, as long as you go through that federal paperwork, you can be in possession of those items. There are some date restrictions on when the item must have been manufactured and registered and things like that. But there is not a complete ban like President Biden likes to put forward. So again, just completely false. And again, facts matter. And just giving you, and I think a lot of people knew this. And I think when you hear Biden and individuals on the anti-gun side say this, you're just like, that's 100% false. And I don't know who's buying this. And again, another interesting thing that you hear Biden say all the time is a majority of gun owners agree with me that we need some sort of ban. I don't know where they're getting those polls, but that's just simply not true. There are a ton of polls recently that show the majority of individuals in the US do not favor or are not in favor of a ban on so-called assault weapons or a ban on so-called large capacity magazines. There are a ton of polls that show that also. And I think this is just interesting how they try to lump themselves into being gun owners and pro Second Amendment and then say, well, there's a ton of people in favor of these things. And it's just simply the Republicans in Congress that are stopping this. No, that's not true. And they know that's not true. Majority of people in the US are not in favor of these types of bans. And we've seen also recently, even those people who were potentially on the fence, because of the whole lockdown issues, we saw a lot more people on the liberal side, the Democrat side, the anti-gun side, whatever you want to call them, all of a sudden see the value of keeping and bearing arms. Because what happened the second that there was lockdowns and there were some riots and things that popped up in our nation that before we didn't really necessarily have to worry about, or people never really had to face. It was always looming that potentially could happen. But then once it did happen, what did everybody do? There were lines out the door 4 days at gun stores. Ammunition was almost impossible to find. Firearms were flying off the shelves. The background check numbers nationwide went higher than they ever have. They're continuing very high. So there were a lot of people who were anti-gun or were I guess maybe even agnostic to firearms, all of a sudden saw the importance of having a firearm for your protection and your family's protection, and also the potential that this issue of the federal government, this overarching authority and authoritarianism over the people could cause a lot of issues. So I think a lot of people saw the light because of that. So this whole argument that a majority of owners agree with me that we need a ban on so-called assault weapons and on large capacity magazines, I just think, again, is false if you really look at the numbers. Now, another thing that I want to point out is this discussion about so-called assault weapons and so-called large capacity magazines, and that the individual here was in possession of 2 so-called assault weapons. As I stated at the beginning, that's simply just not true. This individual was not, the language of a so-called assault weapon, and I say so-called because really, there are some legal definitions. So when I talk about California state law specifically on the channel, I will reference so-called assault weapons definitions because California at least has expressly defined what they consider to be an assault weapon. Federally, there isn't. Now, of course, Biden would love there to be a federal definition of so-called assault weapons and there to be a prohibition on them in magazines as well. But for him to say, there are assault weapons is just simply not true. And I guess it's not as true as far as the traditional context that we consider, at least what traditionally the anti-gun side had said is a so-called assault weapon. What Biden, I think, is doing here is hinting at this speech when he says there were 2 assault weapons at the location that were used. One of the interesting things I think is happening right now in the firearms debate is the anti-gun side is trying to expand the definition of an assault weapon. They are trying to make it much more inclusive than they traditionally have. So, for example, in the state of California, there are really kind of 2 definitions of a so-called assault weapon. You have the Roberti Roos list, which has a list of expressly stated makes and models of firearms that are considered to be so-called assault weapons and therefore are prohibited. For example, things like AKs, Uzis, they have specific manufacturers and names of firearms that are on that list. And then later, California expanded it through California Penal Code 30515, which is a characteristics ban. And the characteristics ban talks about things like a semi-automatic centerfire rifle that has a detachable magazine and has specific features like a collapsible or telescoping stock, a flash hider, a forward vertical grip, or just a pistol grip. And that's why you see those funky firearms in the state of California with fin grips, and we have to use comps if we want a detachable magazine, and we have to pin the stock, can't have a vertical grip. So that's how California has defined it. But what Biden is, I think, trying to point at here, and which we've seen a lot during these discussions in the wake of this incident, is they are pushing for a much more expansive definition of these types of firearms. And I would point you to what President Biden said and what Kamala Harris also put forward when they were running for the presidency. They put forward a definition in their eyes of what an assault weapon would be. And it was much more expansive. What it came to be was any type of semi-automatic centerfire rifle that has a detachable magazine and has the capability of accepting a magazine that has more than 10 rounds, which really is almost any and all firearms, maybe outside of revolvers and some shotguns. So it was a much more comprehensive and expansive definition of so-called assault weapons. And I think that's what Biden is pointing to here, is what they would like to define as so-called assault weapons is really anything that has a magazine that can accept more than 10 rounds, which would include a bunch of handguns, AR pistols, AK pistols, a ton of different styles of rifles, some shotguns, really a ton of items, almost all items. And that's what they would love to restrict nationally. So I think that's why when you see him say, there were 2 so-called assault weapons used during this incident, even though a Kel-Tec Sub 2000 was used and an AR pistol, and maybe even a handgun could fall into this definition. But when he's pointing to the 2, that's really what he's doing. It's because he's using this expansive definition of what they believe. And also it could just be simply because it's a black firearm that looks scary in their eyes and, has a magazine that, is more than 10 rounds. And so they just would love to lump them all into one category. Without really knowing what a Kel-Tec Sub 2000 is, or really knowing the firearms that are being used here. And I think that's also a huge sticking point when you have some of these anti-gun individuals, some people like Biden administration talking about firearms, is their complete lack of knowledge about what these firearms really are, what their capabilities really are, and what their capabilities aren't. In that speech, you heard Biden talk about how these rifles shoot a round that don't just go through, but they will hit you and completely just obliterate the body, just, separate you off, at your torso, just cut you in half. You've heard them talk about how you can blow someone's head off. You've heard them talk about how some of these rounds can go through a bunch of body armor and Kevlar and would go then through vehicles and brick walls and all these things, and how destructive they are and how they expand and just completely obliterate the body, without really knowing the actual ballistics or having really any real knowledge about the firearms. Now, candidly, I'm not a huge ballistics person. I don't do ballistics tests. I don't have a ton of experience, but I am a firearms owner. I shoot ARs quite often. I shoot handguns quite often. I've shot machine guns, tons of different items. I've shot Barretts, 50 cals. I've shot a ton of things, grenade launchers. I've seen tanks shoot. I've seen flamethrowers. I've seen RPGs. And the reality is they're just trying to make these so bad claimed assault weapons, these ARs, sound so scary. They do this a lot also in litigation, where they will have an expert witness, and that expert witness is supposed to be an expert for the government, showing, I guess, how lethal these firearms are. And they will always put forward these same arguments about how damaging these specific, 223, 5.56 rounds really are, and how they can cut someone in half and blow someone's, and it's just simply not true. And I think you, the listener or the watcher, know that that's just simply not true. A 223 round, a 5.56 is not hyper lethal. It is a lethal round. All firearms are lethal. They are all dangerous, which is important. That's why they're useful, because they are dangerous items. They are lethal items. They are useful for lethal force, or else, we would probably be using something else if they weren't useful. So that's important. But to say that, a 223 round is just so much more hyper lethal than other types of rounds, which you will see quite often Biden and his administration say, well, why do you need these ones? You just use your, Pappy's hunting rifle. A lot of those hunting rifles use rounds that are far more lethal than a 223 round. A shotgun, double aught buckshot is far more, can be hyper damaging if, than a 223 round or a 9mm or 40. So again, I think it just, a lot of that comes down to the lack of real knowledge about what the firearms are that they're talking about, what the rounds really are that they're talking about. And it just sounds good for them to say, these things are just explosive rounds and they just will cut you in half and they're just so lethal. Yes, they're dangerous. Like I'll concede that. Obviously, firearms are lethal. Some of these rounds are lethal and dangerous, but are they at the scale that they love to put forward for why then they need to be banned? No, they aren't. So again, I think that's important. As far as this discussion, I don't want to labor this too long, but as far as the speech that Biden came out and gave, I think you can hear in it, there are just a ton of falsehoods. There, in my opinion, was absolutely zero truth to this speech that he came out and gave. I think you can refute almost everything that he said in this speech. It was just chock full of anti-gun talking points with no logic behind them, with no legal basis behind them, no historical basis behind them. And now, do I think that they will ever, as of right now, pass a national ban on so-called assault weapons or large capacity magazines? I don't think so. I hope I'm not wrong, but I think right now, at least since we have the House, that won't happen. And but I would never say never, because a lot of people forget about the national assault weapons ban that did pass, and Biden talks about it quite often, how he got it passed. And recently we saw the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act also get passed, which he mentions in this speech as well. So it's not like gun control hasn't passed at a national level before, specifically in regards to assault weapons and magazine bans. That's happened before in our recent history. In recent history, we've also seen a bipartisan gun control bill get passed, which is causing a lot of issues as far as also Biden's executive orders that he's putting in place now, trying to push for more national red flag laws and incentivize states to push for more red flag laws, which caused a lot of issues. So I don't think that we would ever get a national ban on so-called assault weapons, but I could be wrong. And you just never know based on what happens. You know, it only takes maybe one of these incidents. You know, every time one of these incidents happen, you have Biden administration and individuals in Congress come out pushing for this type of legislation, for this type of gun control. And I don't think they will ever stop. And really it just takes a change in Congress and the presidency to make it happen. And we really don't know what's going to happen as far as the presidential race going forward. You know, there's a lot of questions about what's really going on in our democracy right now, about our voting and things of that nature. So you just never know. So I just think you guys need to be, my best advice to you is just be educated, understand where their talking points come from. Make sure you have the items you can lawfully have, or, you know, do whatever you feel necessary. Make sure you have items. Don't discount anything as far as potential bans, because I know a lot of people right now, Illinois is going through a body armor potential ban, and Illinois at a state level is, you know, doing the assault weapons ban. And then you saw Washington with their magazine ban. And then you saw Oregon with their purchase to permit, or permit to purchase, and then their magazine ban. So we've seen a ton of state level action. So I think you just need to be vigilant, understand the talking points of the anti-gun side, but also understand at a state level, at a national level, anything is potentially possible. I don't recommend you just go out and buy a ton of stuff. I don't think that that's necessary. But just be aware. Take it from someone in California. You don't know how quickly things could change, where all of a sudden overnight, they say you can't buy X, Y, Z. You can't all of a sudden purchase ammunition, get it shipped to your door. You can't purchase certain types of handguns. You can't purchase certain types of magazines. You can't purchase certain types of rifles. Really, that's just a stroke of a pen away, which is unfortunate. The Second Amendment is very clear, shall not be infringed. We're having to litigate a lot of these things, and I think we are getting some very positive movement as far as litigation, and Bruin is a big help and is a big reason why we are now getting a ton of wins on the litigation side. But just be aware that this type of stuff is still going on. These talking points are still out there. A lot of these arguments, like I said, are not legitimate arguments. They haven't been legitimate for a very long time, but they're still using them to push their agenda. And some of their agenda is still passing despite the fact that they just have no basis. You know, it's insane to me that states are still passing magazine bans and bans on so-called assault weapons and things of that nature. So, you know, that's just my breakdown of Biden, his speech, my retort to a lot of the statements that he's made. Hopefully you guys found this informative. Like I mentioned, if you're listening to this over on the audio side, make sure you are leaving reviews. That really does help the algorithm side over there. I also, again, want to thank our partners over at Gas Digital Network who are helping on the audio side. And if you're watching this over on YouTube, thank you guys so much for all of your support. I just want to mention again that if you're watching this over on YouTube, this is a separate podcast channel and it's different from the main YouTube channel. This channel specifically is just for the podcast. So make sure you are subscribed to this channel as well to listen to the podcast. This is going to be longer form content here over on this channel. It's not going to be the quick, 8 to 9 minute videos that I do over the main channel. This is going to be more comprehensive, a little bit more free speech-esque type of platform here and discussions here. So I can dig a little bit deeper in some of these topics and have more of a conversation with you guys. And then also have conversations with other people. Like I did an interview with John Lovell recently. I've done interviews with Jared from Guns and Gadgets, and I'll do more interviews with more people going forward. But that's what I'm doing over here on this podcast YouTube channel. So make sure you're subscribed here, like, comment, all of that, because that helps the algorithm. So thank you guys so much for listening or watching. And as always, never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.